Deep Weird Dialogues with me, Dr. Jack Hunter, where I'm talking with contributors to the book Deep Weird about their chapters and some of the ideas that are contained within them. And today I'm joined by psychical researcher Alan Murdie, who has done a lot of research on poltergeists and actually has some experience working with some of the legends of poltergeist research like Maurice, Grosse and Lyon Playfair. So first of all, I guess, Alan, could you tell us what a poltergeist is?
Well, the word poltergeist arrived in the English language in 1847, introduced from the German. Its first usage in English is in a Victorian classic of the paranormal, The Night Side of Nature, published by Mrs. Catherine Crowe, and she devoted a chapter to the poltergeist of the Germans. And in German, it was one of a number of names. It seems to have originally been coined by Martin Luther, the stimulus for the Protestant Reformation, but it was being used for invisible but noisy and primarily physical disturbances, banging sounds, raps, knocking noises, and the movement of objects. And it's derived from the German poltern, meaning rattling or rumbling, and Geist or Geister for spirit. And Mrs. Crowe realised that this was a term applicable to various disturbances which matched this German archetypal form exactly in Britain. Cases of disturbed households where crockery and furniture flew about, apparently by itself, where there were loud scratchings, knockings, and banging noises. These had already been well known and documented in the 19th century and the 18th century. And indeed, that remains very much the pattern today. What we do know about poltergeists is they are worldwide. These strange physical disturbances, which can sometimes expand into the movement of furniture, into the lighting of fires, the interference with electrical equipment. What characterizes them is there is physicality. These are actual objective events occurring without apparent cause, both around people and at certain locations. And they follow various patterns. Although we don't understand the mechanism behind them, what we can say is that they are consistent over the centuries. What impresses me most of all about the evidence is if I use a test which we use in courtrooms to convict people for some of the most serious offences on the statute book. Well, it's a test called similar fact evidence, where you look at striking similarities between reports or complaints of offences, and where those striking similarities occur, it's treated as probative. Well, if you apply exactly that same standard of proof and evidence to poltergeists, because we know these things are occurring in the physical world around us, they can be recorded objectively. If on tape or in some cases photographed, there's no end of supporting evidence. It's not just purely eyewitness testimony. When you apply the same standards as if you were trying to prove a crime in the courtroom, then I consider poltergeists are proved to a standard beyond reasonable doubt, in that we are dealing with an effect which we cannot, on current scientific models, explain. That's a rather long-winded answer, you appreciate,
Yeah.
but it's what we can say is a poltergeist is a pattern of physical and environmental changes, an anomaly which we cannot currently explain, and they largely occur in domestic premises. Not always, but there are subsidiary patterns that show up in the disturbances in terms of who poltergeists can afflict, how long they last. There's a whole lot of subsets of data which start to emerge from them when you analyze them. So that what ultimately lies behind them, well, that's where we get into deep, weird territory.
Yeah. So you had some experience working with people like Maurice Grosse, who was the investigator on the Enfield poltergeist, which is obviously a very famous poltergeist case, and also with Guy Playfair. So I wonder if you could just say a couple of words about, what that experience was like and what kinds of things you may have talked to them about.
Well, indeed, I knew both Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair for 20 years. I first met Maurice Grosse in 1987. I met Guy Lyon Playfair a few years later. I knew Maurice up until his death in 2006, and I came to know Guy Playfair very well in the time I knew him up until he died in 2018. And it was a great apprenticeship for me. What struck me, I think, about both of these researchers was how open-minded they were to the question of causation. They had, by far and away, between them, witnessed more poltergeist activity, probably firsthand, direct, than probably any other living psychical researchers. Guy Playfair had long-standing, what got him interested was long-standing experience in Brazil following poltergeists, and actually succeeded in recording raps and knocks as early as 1973. When he came back to Britain, that's when he fortuitously met Maurice Grosse, just at the time of the Enfield poltergeist outbreak. Now, the problem with the Enfield case is not lack of data, it is too much. Most people do not realize the huge quantity of material that was gathered. There are over 130 recordings. Effects are recorded on different media. The problem with a big scale case such as Enfield is not lack of data. It's frankly too much. It really does need, and much of the data is fortunately preserved in the archives of the Society for Psychical Research now, the original recordings and so on. It's taken best over 40 years for these to really start to get further, closer analysis that they deserve. I mean, Maurice and Guy, right from the beginning, were very open with their data, and it's really, I think, only in the last 15 years, particularly when people have gone back to analysing the sound recordings, that that serious scientific scrutiny has been there. Of course, Enfield was particularly controversial, but when you look actually at the critics, I'm afraid none of them have actually, with one exception, have actually gone back to the original data. I used to ask quite regularly Maurice Grosse and Guy Playfair if any of the skeptics who attacked them publicly from time to time had ever actually come to them or ever examined any of the original data. The answer was always the same: no, they haven't. The only skeptic on Enfield who has actually done that is Dr. Melvin Willin, who came when Maurice Grosse died. He bequeathed his collections to the SBR library. Dr. Willin, as archivist, went through a vast amount of the material and data. And at the end of it, he said, well, I have changed my mind over Enfield. I no longer think it was a case of childish tomfoolery. And in fact, anybody who goes back to the original sources will, I'm afraid, reach that conclusion. There is more evidence for the outbreak of the Enfield poltergeist and it being involving unexplained effects than there is in many serious crimes being prosecuted through the courts. Far more evidence than you get in most murder cases, in most serious frauds, and also far more evidence than you get in many cases of serious sexual offending. So if we apply a legal standard of proof, I'm afraid the Enfield case is proven. And the other failure of the critics over the years, which I think is the ultimate one. You get people who are saying, "Oh, it was all the children messing about, or it was all kind of malobservation, and it was all invented." Some people claim, and so on. It was a glorious hoax. Well, the problem is that we have got, as I said, extensive records, different media, um, transcripts, tape recordings, the whole lot. Now, and this all points in the direction of this being paranormal. Now, the people who criticize this, in my view, are the equivalent of the people who say the moon landings didn't happen. Because if Neil Armstrong was not walking on the moon in July 1969, well, it must mean that something else was going on. He was somewhere else, and so on. And it's the same with Enfield. Either it occurred as the investigators reported it, and they weren't the only investigators there as well, it must be remembered. Either it occurred as they said, or it means something else has happened. And it is the failure of the critics in approaching 50 years, nearly, it will be in 4 years' time, to actually be able to produce any evidence as to what was really happening. It's the same when you get into people like conspiracy theories like Holocaust deniers. If that wasn't happening in World War II, well, what actually was? Where is the trail of evidence that proves the alternative event? And of course, none of these people can produce it because that evidence is not there. What is actually there is what Guy and Maurice accumulated, and data which is still being studied. So in the course of that, I also have absorbed as well the lessons that Guy and Maurice applied to it. They were Maurice was always very clear. He said, "I'm not one for theories. I'm just here for gathering," and that opened him up to all kinds of wide possibilities. He once said to me, "I'm interested in all aspects of the paranormal, with the possible exception of UFOs." Up until I really looked at the Enfield case, I was very much of the idea that yes, there's psychic effects, there appears to be psychokinesis, the recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis RSPK model of William Roll. It's all ultimately the unconscious mind. After looking at the Enfield data and one or two other similar large scale cases, I am no longer convinced that the purely human causation is behind this. I can see Guy never really did reach any conclusions. Ultimately, he was prepared to look at every theory. Maurice felt that the only explanation, really, for what he certainly witnessed at Enfield, was that there was some further discarnate consciousness, not necessarily a very high form of consciousness, but there were discarnate elements involved. And so I have come to I've certainly, reversed my opinion. Say, if I've been having this conversation 15 years ago, I'd have said that was all the unconscious mind. But the more I've looked into it, the more I've followed and understood their approach and their thinking on it. I've come round to think it can't just simply be the unconscious mind um, in these fascinating outbreaks.
That's great. Well, thank you very much,
Sorry again, a bit
Alan.
of a rambling
No, it's
long answer
perfect.
to your question, Jack.
So, if you're interested in finding out more about poltergeists and Alan's work and the Enfield poltergeist and where these things might merge together with high strangeness, check out Alan's chapter in Deep Weird. Thank you very much.